Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is Linda Jones, and I'll be hosting tonight's webinar. We're expecting around about 45 people to be online listening in tonight. Welcome to everyone who is already in the room. I'll also be helped tonight by co-hosts, Leela Griffiths. Leela is an urban designer from the city of Greater Geelong, and Jacinta Rivette, who's a senior strategic planner also with the city. So it's been a bit of a journey undertaking regarding the development of the urban design framework for South Geelong. Urban design frameworks take a very long view, which is very much important to remember. Often when we look at what's being proposed, we think about today and ourselves. And what we really need with something like an urban design framework is to think to the future generations, to our children and their children and their children's children, and what their needs might be and what their future challenges might be and how they will need to live and want to live their lives. What a UDF can do for these future generations is put in place mechanisms to ensure that the cultural heritage of the area is protected and that sustainable contemporary housing can actually become part of a continuing heritage. Since the 2 rounds of engagement, much work has been undertaken to respond to the issues many people raised during those sessions, many sessions that we had. In the final round, back in to 2021, I think, you provided and confirmed the things that really matter most to you. And those understandings have guided the additional work that's been undertaken by your council. So what are these things? Well, you care about the architectural heritage and streetscapes of your neighbourhood. And actually, for many of you, it's the reason you live in the neighbourhood and why you want it protected. Following that second round of engagement, planned heritage assessments and plans were undertaken, and a report which has resulted in the inclusion of 193 additional dwellings and 9 landscaped road reserves into the Heritage Overlay HO 1641 for South Geelong. You care about sustainable design and modest development. Now, following this feedback, a capacity and change area review was conducted and 3 separate areas were identified. These identified areas nominate where change through development might occur. In some areas, development's not appropriate at all. But in other areas that were investigated, they could accommodate some change. And we're going to hear a lot more about the change areas and the implications to the neighbourhood as we move into the webinar. So around the railway station, and including the Barwon Water Site and Moorabool Street, these are the areas where change could occur to accommodate not just future housing, but commercial and social infrastructure needs as well. So it's in these areas that medium density development to 6 stories with a focus on sustainable design is actually being proposed. And again, we'll hear more about that in the webinar. The final thing was that you've got some concerns regarding population growth and the potential impacts. The station hub, Barwon Water Site and Moorabool Street are proposed for additional housing. Now, housing is a key challenge to communities throughout our entire nation. There won't be any one of us who doesn't have a son, a daughter, or a family that is looking to secure and finding it quite challenging to secure dwellings for the future that they want for themselves. Geelong is no different. And within the city, each area is being asked to achieve an equitable solution and response to the population growth that you're experiencing now and will continue to experience into the future. A diversity of housing that needs to be accommodated, and this will include a proportion of social housing to meet the city's vision and the needs of those who are moving to the city. But the city's vision is a commitment to an inclusive and caring community, and social housing and being able to accommodate people is part of that care and inclusion. So tonight, our panel of experts will explain the thinking behind the UDF in a bit more detail, and they'll also address the questions that some of you submitted. Now, for those of you who did submit questions, thank you very, very much. That was greatly appreciated. I've gone through each and every one of them, and I've picked those that most represent the key things that people seemed to want to know more about. And it's those that our panelists will address, the thinking and the representative questions. So tonight you're going to hear more about the change areas, about the heritage overlay, about the Barwon Water Site and Moorabool Street key developments, about social housing and about active transport. Now, before I formally introduce the panelists to you, as you know, this is a webinar, and as such, it's you who hear from them. As you listen, you might think, oh, I've got a question about that, or I'd like to know more about that, or I'm very curious about that. Now, I would really appreciate it, and so would Jacinta and Leila, if you used the chat function. The chat function is down the bottom of your screen on most screens, and it will allow you to make comments and to also ask your questions. Now, some of those questions we may have time to pick up on tonight. Others we will address, the team will address in the coming weeks, either by publishing them online or dealing directly with you. Now, if there are lots of questions, this will lead to a number of workshops online, smaller conversation circles, where the questions that you've raised can be addressed in more detail. So the message is, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. We will be monitoring it, and thank you very much for that. Right, our panelists for tonight. Jessica Hurst. Jessica achieved her planning degree in urban planning and development and economic geography at the University of Melbourne. She is presently the manager of planning and growth in the city of Greater Geelong, which many of you will know, a position she's held for nearly 3 years. She leads a team that plans the city's response to growth in a time which cannot be explained any other way but as historic change and renewal. Dr. Jonathan Daly. Jonathan is the Manager of Urban Design and Heritage with the city. Jonathan has experience working across urban design, architecture and planning in Europe, North America and Australasia. He received his PhD in urban design from the University of Melbourne and has led the urban design and heritage team at the city for the past 2 years. David Scott. David is a planner and deliverer of integrated and sustainable outcomes and has been the city's senior heritage planner for nearly 3 years. He brings experience and insights into strategic thinking, problem solving, and managing heritage and construction. David is currently completing his PhD on the history of the highest goldfield in Australia. I'm thinking about having that fact checked, which is at Kiandra. So welcome, Jess, welcome, John, welcome, David. Let's begin. Now, our first topic is around the proposed changed areas. This additional work has identified the most appropriate areas for change within the boundaries of the UDF. Now, Jess, you've got a lot of knowledge and experience with change areas and also land uses. What can you tell the audience about the development of these change areas, why the work was undertaken, why it's important, and what it actually delivers?
Thanks, Linda. And before the city staff get into the question and answers, we'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people as the traditional owners of the land, water, airs and skies of our South Geelong community. And we pay our respects to their elders past and present. And we acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of our Greater Geelong community today. Now into the answers and description of what we've done. So certainly one of the toughest things for us is there's always a tension between planning policies that seek to balance housing choice and housing growth, especially for young people and older people looking for smaller and more affordable homes, and the preservation of local neighbourhood character. And throughout the previous consultations, we certainly heard very clearly that the local character of the areas around the South Geelong station were very important, and that facilitating redevelopment could impact on that valued character. So in terms of how we balance that, those competing objectives, got to acknowledge that South Geelong has been nominated as an increased housing diversity area. So an area for change in planning policy for well over 10 years now. The council's goal is to have 50% of infill development, 50% of development occurring as infill in established neighbourhoods, and 50% of new housing occurring in the greenfield estates on the edge of the city. So this overall goal seeks to balance the impacts on existing areas whilst also protecting farmland from urban sprawl and increasing housing affordability and diversity across the city. At the moment, we're seeing about 25% of new housing being delivered as infill in established areas. So we've got a way to go to achieve our overall sustainable development goals. So strategies like this South Geelong Urban Design Framework seek to help us make sure that the redevelopment that we see in local neighbourhoods is regulated and guided appropriately to respond to that local character. So following the draft UDF, our planners and urban designers undertook a further piece of work and inspected again each of the streets in South Geelong in a great deal of detail through the housing capacity and change analysis that Linda described earlier. So this detailed analysis reviewed the existing character of the area to understand where there were areas within the broader Geelong neighbourhood that could accommodate change, and how the new heritage areas also could impact on this. We didn't focus, as part of that study, we didn't focus on the key development sites, had they'd already been identified to accommodate additional change, and had already had architectural and urban design analysis been undertaken for them. So this is really about the local streets where we've got 1 and 2 story houses. So the change in capacity study reviewed the common attributes of the area. So we looked at each of the houses in the streets. We looked at the lot size, the vegetation types, the area of the housing, the front fencing, the height of the building, the heritage nature of the building stock in detail, street by street. And that study identified 9 different neighbourhoods where there were similar attributes. From this, we were then able to assess the level of change that was appropriate to occur in the areas. And these have become known as the minimal, incremental and substantial change areas.
Okay, well, just many people are interested in the implications to their properties, as you would expect. So we have a question that was submitted by Jennifer, who asks, what impact will the reclassification of properties to substantial change areas have on existing residents and landowners?
Now I've just popped a map up on the screen. Hopefully that has shared. If someone can just give me a thank you. This will try and help explain what these different areas mean. So we expect these areas will develop differently over time, and certainly wouldn't expect every site to be redeveloped. This is about guiding where that redevelopment does occur, what form it should take. So minimal change areas, and hopefully you can see my cursor. So minimal change areas are this very pale pink area. The top here and down around Foster Street, Ballyang Street. These are areas with heritage significance. And in these areas, we'd expect a small number of townhouses and extensions to the existing dwellings, predominantly 1 and 2 stories. Then we've got incremental change areas. So this area is around Richmond Crescent, where it didn't have the necessarily heritage characteristics, but it did have some consistency in the character of the dwellings and the streets around that area. And in that area, we'd expect to see townhouses and extensions. Again, predominantly 1 to 2 stories. You may see some 3-story additions on larger sites. And then to Jennifer's question in particular, so the substantial change areas. So these are the darkest pink areas, if you take these ones as magenta. So these darkest pink areas, so fronting onto West Fines Street, immediately around the station, and then up here on Jeringhap Street and Kilgore Street. So these are the substantial change areas. So this is where there's no heritage significance in the properties at a precinct scale and very limited common street attributes. So you might have quite a bit of variability in the dwellings that are in those streets. And in these areas, we'd expect townhouses and low-level apartment buildings up to a height of 4 stories. And then finally, the major redevelopment areas or the key development areas are in the magenta. And in these areas, we'd expect to see apartments of 6 to 7 stories with ground floor commercial uses. So hang on, I've gone off script here. I've upset my slides. There we go. Excuse me. So then the substantial change areas and the key development sites, they'll become the new increased housing diversity area around the South Geelong station. So we've always had one, and then in the draft, it was a much wider area extending to 800 metres from the station. So a much bigger area was picked up and included as an increased housing diversity area. But as a result of this work, we've reduced the extent of that increased housing diversity area to what you see on the screen now as part of this final draft. So in summary, much of South Geelong will continue to be 1 to 2 story development as we see now. There'll be fewer properties that will be able to be demolished because of the additional heritage overlays. We will see the most intensive development occur in substantial change areas and the key development areas. We'll develop new planning policy that will guide how that development is delivered over time. And there'll be some changes to zones and overlays to reflect what's recommended in the UDF. And just as the case is now, new developments will be regulated by Res Code and the Victorian planning provisions to ensure that amenity impacts such as overshadowing and overlooking continue to be managed to minimise impact on existing amenity from that new development.
Hugh's just put a question in the chat regarding, was South Geelong listed as a key development area before this plan, or was it just IHDA? Hugh, if you could just wait till we get to the questions around the key development areas, and I'm sure Jonathan will have something that he could add to that. Otherwise, we'd take that one on notice. Thank you for that. Okay, let's just shift gear to heritage. Now, you all know, or mostly everyone knows, that an extension to the area's heritage overlay is proposed, and it responds to feedback provided by the community. The additional 193 dwellings and 9 landscapes reserves have been added. So David, can you give us an overview of how this came about, the recommendations, what was done, before we address a question from Dale.
Yes, okay. I'll just start with sharing my screen, hopefully. Okay. During the course of preparing the urban design framework, 2 heritage studies were undertaken. There was initial heritage character study of the South Geelong area undertaken by Dr. David Rowe. And then following the community sessions and feedback, we actually undertake a further review, which was the South Geelong study on the right there. Both those studies are available on the website. Dr. Rowe's study identified the importance of the South Geelong area in demonstrating the street grid developed for the CBD and South Geelong area by surveyor Robert Hoddle in 1838. So it's a very early town planning in the state of Victoria. I'll just move on to that. Okay, so here's an extract of the early Hoddle grid, as we call it. So the street layouts and the lot subdivisions from this early time have defined the character of South Geelong today, you know, especially in respect of the broad landscaped streets running between the bay and the Barwon River, and there's some major cross streets in that as well. There's also, in terms of the subdivision, most of the lots have very narrow lot frontages. The main residences are set back behind a very small garden and an almost running boundary to boundary. And another key factor in this area is the fact that there are narrow service lanes at the rear of properties. And one of the reasons why the character of South Geelong is so intact today is because of those service lanes. One of the greatest impacts on any heritage precinct is vehicle accommodation. And the fact that in South Geelong, vehicle accommodation has traditionally been at the rear of the properties, away from the major street frontages, is one of the reasons this area has such a quality streetscape character and is highly valued today. Yeah, so within this early layout, residential development occurred in 3 major phases up to the close of the 1930s. As a consequence, South Geelong possesses a particularly fine collection of Victorian, Federation and interwar style dwellings. Some other examples that exist may not be as fine as these, but altogether the collective value of the included properties has a combined heritage significance that is actually greater than the sum significance of the individual properties. Now, Dr. Rowe recommended a number of new areas be included in heritage overlays from within South Geelong because of this very strong character and the historical links to the Hoddle grid. And following consultation, community feedback suggested that it would support wider areas being included, that there were greater areas of high conservation value than those identified in the original study. And so that was why the second study was commissioned, and it actually expanded the proposed areas. Now, in the second study, we actually took a detailed review, property by property, across the whole area. Now, these aren't necessarily, this is indicative of the review. This is part of the heritage report that's on the web. It's not actually properties of outstanding individual significance, but it shows the consideration that has gone into them. The third property, 277 Bellarine Street, this is one that was actually classified as non-contributory. It's a replacement to an original building, but in its favour, the owners there, they retained the scale, the character, the setback, the front fence treatment, which is a feature of the housing in South Geelong. 289 is actually a bit quite interesting in that although it's a 1930s or early 40s structure, it has a corner shop front, and the corner shop fronts we also found in the second study were a bit of a feature of the area, and it's proposed that we retain the ability to retain the use of these corner shops. Only a couple at the moment are currently being used for commercial purposes, but a number still exist elsewhere and they're part of a house. But at some point in the future, we wanted to make it possible that they might be returned to a commercial use. because that would be a positive contribution to the community, and it's certainly part of the character of the area. Okay, now this is a summary map. I've just coloured in a little. The brown areas indicate the existing individual heritage listings, and also the heritage areas, the South City area primarily. There's also a Southeast heritage area. Now, the pink shaded areas indicate the extent of the proposed additions to the South City Heritage Overlay. And what you can see is we're trying to create a reasonably contiguous area here. In terms of character areas, it's very important that, like, we have entire streets because it's a landscape quality. It's not the individual architectural quality. It's about how the whole street fits together and how it relates to the subdivision and the broader landscape. So hence we have large contiguous areas spanning this. I need to check my notes. So what we're doing here is we're acknowledging the importance of that early subdivision pattern and the prevalence of fine architecture. Now, the South City, the existing precinct, which is, somebody asked a question, do any of us actually live in this area? I actually live on Maud Street in the existing precinct as of just 5 months ago. The existing precinct already had a very demonstration of the subdivision pattern. It also had particularly fine Victorian and Federation architecture. What the new areas actually have is they have a higher proportion of interwall bungalows, which are also fine examples. Now, a few minor changes are proposed to the planning scheme provisions for South City, but mostly they're there for the purpose of greater clarity in what can be done and what can't be done in terms of the planning provisions. There's no substantial changes. So we're effectively just building on the existing format that has been used to manage the South City area to date. So the main objectives are to conserve the landscape character of broad streets and the streetscape character of the historical architecture, whilst allowing for ongoing sustainable adaptation and use of the area to accommodate our community. For the majority of property owners, this requires they retain the historical street front architecture of their properties and modest garden settings with low transparent fences, whilst allowing them to alter and adapt the rear portions of their properties to accommodate modern living needs, be it open plan living areas, vehicle garaging, or even additional accommodation.
Okay, we do have a question from Dale. Who has a different perspective on heritage overlays. In particular, Dale outlines how the proposed heritage changes, they have the potential to limit the ability to achieve diversity in housing, to achieve contemporary energy efficiencies, and to achieve sustainability. So, David, how much does being in a heritage overlay area limit what you're able to achieve and do with your property, particularly around housing, around energy efficiencies and sustainability, and construction?
Yes, I'll break that question up into the three parts. So in respect of housing diversity, the streetscape character of the area is effectively one detached dwelling per lot frontage. And this is something we see as needing to be retained. However, most of the lots have a large area extending rearward of the original house on which a multi-storey addition or a second unit might be possible. And the overlay will not preclude the amalgamation of lots to allow more flexible development options at the rear, provided that original character of one dwelling per lot is retained at the main street frontage. So we may see amalgamation and different layouts happening to the rear of the original houses, pretty much out of sight of the main street. Okay. And see, it's also possible that larger buildings may be developed into multiple tenancies. I'm aware on Yarra Street, there's a former hospital building, which is very large, weatherboard tiled roof structure, which currently serves as 3 individual tenancies. So that sort of thing can certainly happen with larger buildings. In respect of upgrading environmental performance, conservation of historic heritage must go hand in hand with environmental conservation. Hence, retrofitting insulation and double glazing, installing solar systems and rainwater tanks can all be accommodated within the typical South Geelong property. The only consideration is the need to minimise any detrimental effect that may occur on the major street facade, which may necessitate that the water tanks go to the side or the rear of the property. The solar panels might, if the house frontage faces north, the solar panels might need to go on the garage rather than the main front facade. But this is all something that can be negotiated with our heritage advisor and the planning team. In respect to sustainability, it's absolutely crucial to heritage conservation that heritage places have a sustainable ongoing use if they are to survive in the long term. Most properties in South Geelong being residential, it is fully expected that many buildings will require some changes to meet contemporary living standards over time, be it open plan living areas, new kitchens and bathrooms, outdoor entertaining spaces, or vehicle accommodation. The traditional approach to many historic house adaptations is where the original rooms are retained as bedrooms or recycled into spaces suited to their modest size, such as bathrooms or study areas, whilst large modern living areas and outdoor spaces are added to the rear of the original house. Certainly most of the lots in South Geelong are suited to this approach, and in fact, many have already been developed in this manner. Hence, by focusing on preserving the streetscape character and architectural style of buildings along the major streets, and sustainably developing the rear of the properties, it should be possible to both conserve the heritage values of South Geelong and provide for long-term future use by our community. For further information, you may wish to look at the heritage questions and answers sheet, and that's also available on the web.
Okay, thanks, David. If you'd like to stop sharing now.
Sorry, I just need to get out of that. Sorry, my screen just changed. No.
Okay, here we are. Well, not all properties are in the heritage overlay area, and we do know that specific sites and the proposed or the idea of development has attracted a lot of questions. So, Jonathan, you've seen a lot of cities, towns and neighbourhoods around the world that have grown and experienced growth and change. You also know that heights within the UDF for both key development sites, Barwon Water and Moorabool Street, have attracted a lot of comments and a lot of questions. So many people have described what was seen in an impression as high rise. I guess language counts. Is that a correct description? But more importantly, what insights and learnings do you have regarding population growth, and in particular the proposed 6-storey limit that is presently within the interim draft UDF for South Geelong?
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, we know height is always a contentious issue. It doesn't matter what the context is, what city it is, indeed what country it is. It's always, I think, probably one of the top 2 or 3 concerns in most communities. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'll go through a few different things. But just to start, I think it's useful to understand how we arrive at certain heights. And quite often there's a misapprehension in the community that that heights, to some extent, are plucked out of the air. And there's a lot of perceptions around what's an appropriate height. We can't work on the basis of simply to allow the community to select the height, because there's too many different factors that have to be considered. So for example, we have to look at growth forecasts. We have population growth to cater for. We've also got demand for different land uses as well. So those factors go into determining, if you like, how much development we need. There's other factors around that we look at around development opportunities. Where do you put this new development? And the sort of sites that we typically look at are around activity centres, certain public-owned sites that are, maybe there's a change of land use that's required, former industrial lands that no longer serve that purpose, and also around way stations. And that's very common. That's common across the Western world and beyond. We're also looking at development viability. We do rely largely on the private sector to deliver this development, and there's a certain level of development required to make it viable. Part of that, we also look at equity, development equity. So we would never support, for example, overdeveloping one site because that would have a knock-on impact on the development of other sites as well. And this is all before we get down to examining the context. So now we've got sort of an appropriate site and a level of development that we need to meet. And then we start to look at issues around what form that development takes into account. So we look at things like the existing context, the existing scale of development, important views. We want to limit overlooking private residential, overshadowing of private residential and the public realm. And of course, we've had a discussion around the importance of heritage and character. So all of those factors are going into determining the heights that we arrive at. And then we get to the question of the sort of, definition of heights. And I know there's different perceptions of what is too tall in the community, and there's really there's a variety of opinions out there. But obviously we can't plan and design around those perceptions. We need clear definitions to work with. And I'm going to share my screen and talk you through some definitions. So this is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, how they classify low rise, which is 1 to 3 stories, medium rise 4 to 8 stories, high rise 9 to 19 stories, and I might be introducing a new category to most of you tonight, super high rise, which is 20 plus stories. So that's the definitions that we work with. So you can see from the definitions, we're talking about medium rise development on the key development sites. So just to give you, I guess, sort of a reference point for medium rise development, the upper end of the medium rise scale, which is 8 stories, is the equivalent of the Geelong Library and Heritage Centre. I think most people watching tonight will be familiar with that building. And I hope most of you would agree that it doesn't constitute high rise. Now, we're not working at the upper end of the scale. We're working at maximum 6 stories. So looking at the Barwon Water site. And you can see here that it's not the entire site that we're proposing to be 6 stories. It's a portion of the site, which will then transition down to 5 and 3 stories and back into the prevailing character of the area. And here's an artist's impression of that view towards that upper end of 6 stories. Now, I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of what this might actually look like in reality. So here's another artist's impression of a development, similar-ish development in Fairfield. This is the Nightingale development model that was proposed for right next to, you can see, Fairfield Station. So this is the development, and there's some similarities between this and what's been proposed in South Geelong. It's adjacent to that to the station. It's close to the activity centre. It's a predominantly very suburban, very low-rise area. And this is what it actually looks like after it was constructed. Now, this development falls probably more into the kind of affordable housing type of development. In the Barwon Water site, we're looking at social housing. Now, this is how we used to do social housing. I think we can all agree that we didn't do it very well in the past. So there's a couple of examples on the left from Carlton, and on the right is Albert Park. So both in Melbourne. This is how we do social housing today. So I'm not going to go through the individual examples, they're all in Victoria, but you can see that it's significantly different to how we used to do that kind of development. And actually not too different to the Nightingale in Fairfield. And I think it's really important to also note that, you know, these two social housing developments, one in Carlton and one in Albert Park, I know there's been concern about the impact on property values from social housing. As you can see, the median house price in Albert Park, well over $2 million, and it goes up. I know of one house that sold within 200 meters of this social housing for over $10 million recently. So we know that it doesn't have that detrimental impact on property prices. And I think that's an important message for the community to hear tonight as well. So I might leave it there, Linda.
Yes. Okay. Now, during the engagement, people voiced concern over the market viability of increased height and density of housing. So we're talking about the market now. And we have a question from Hugh, who's online tonight, who says that the UDF states the assessment concluded that the townhouse development in both scenarios are feasible with mixed results in relation to the medium density option, 2 to 3 stories, and higher density, 5 to 10 stories, having limited feasibility. The apartment developments presented in other options are not feasible in the current market, and it is difficult to determine a time frame for when the market in Geelong will have greater demands for apartment living. So that's the quote. The question from Hugh is, why will you not listen to the community and the council's own assessment and just propose townhouses and building to 3 stories on the key development sites?
Well, I think there's probably maybe a little bit of misapprehension around this issue in terms of what the report is actually saying. So, of course, the report is talking about this specific point in time. We already have seen in Geelong, since the report was produced, significant increase in demand for apartments and in applications that we're receiving for apartments. So that's one aspect of it, but it speaks to, I think, where the demand is going in the future. And the UDF is very much about the future. And if you look at what the UDF is trying to do, it's you know, I spoke earlier about identifying those key development opportunities. And what we've done is to do that, to focus around the station where that site was available, and also the main street along Miracle Street. And in doing so, we're protecting most of the existing residential housing from from medium rise or further development. So we need to protect. If we were to build townhouses, for example, in the Barwon Water site, we would lose that opportunity to meet that demand in the future, to be able to provide the kind of housing of diversity that we need to provide, that Jess talked about, and housing affordability as well. So we're protecting those important goals that we have, that we need to meet for the future.
Okay, now Hugh follows on by asking, why did you not include expected dwelling numbers for options 1 and 2 in the first UDF, so the first iteration of the UDF. Hugh was at a workshop and asked how many dwellings were going to be built in option 1 and 2 across the Barwon Water site and the South Geelong car park, and was told a total of approximately 220 across both sites. So I guess the question is around how many.
Well, I think maybe to address the why not or why wasn't it, the draft UDF was informed by an economic assessment that was provided by Barwon Water at the time, which we couldn't make that publicly available. But we took on board community feedback on the draft, and we also undertook a more detailed economic analysis for the interim final UDF. So it's important to, I think, to remember that this is the interim final, and that we'll be taking on board the community's feedback again in developing the final UDF.
Okay. All right. Now we have got the questions are coming in. So there are a number of ones here around heritage. I'll just get the panelists to have a little look at some of those. But while they're doing that, there's a question here about social housing, and there's also been a question regarding social housing raised earlier amongst the questions that have been put forward. Jacqueline, who submitted this question, asks, what does social housing mean, and will there be a fixed percentage in the final accommodation options for the Barwon Water redevelopment site? So Jess, if I could get you to start that, and we'll see whether this will address the previous question.
I think I can tackle both, Linda, at the same time.
Same, yes.
Jacqueline's question and the one that was raised by Adam tonight.
Adam, there he is.
So
yes, I'll just we might just read this out, Adam, just to refresh. That Adam says, I support the proposed increased density and housing choice, particularly to provide additional social and affordable housing to assist in addressing the fact that the fastest growing demographic of people becoming homeless is women over the age of 55. Can you please expand on how the increased density will add to the social and affordable housing supply and how it will be integrated? Thanks, Jess.
No worries. So our social housing plan was adopted by the council in 2020. It was a big policy shift for us and a step into this area. So we're seeking to increase the provision of social housing right across Geelong. It's not an issue that's specific to these development sites. And this is because the need across the city is just so great, and it's right across the whole of the municipality. We need, but based on current population and forecast growth, we need an additional 10,000 social housing dwellings by 2041 to meet community need. We currently have about 3,300. So we've got a big task ahead of us as a community to accommodate the most vulnerable members of our community and for them to have a safe home. So Jacqueline's question asks specifically, what is social housing? And there is a definition. Firstly, affordable housing is housing available to low and moderate income households, and that's affordable to them relative to their incomes. And there's specific brackets that we target. Social housing is a subset of affordable housing, and it's owned by the government or community-based organisations where the rent is set at an affordable level. So the property is owned by the Victorian government. They're managed by Homes Victoria and the Department of Families. And community-based organisations are generally registered housing associations who provide the housing on behalf of the government and with a subsidy from the Victorian government. And that's what most of the housing that we're seeing being built now is by these community housing organisations. So if we take the premise that social housing is essential community infrastructure, it should be part of all neighbourhoods. And for low income households where they're paying rent and that can be a real struggle, this leads to all sorts of adverse incomes, financial stress, homelessness, families moving away from their neighbourhoods and unable to focus on maintaining employment and education and their health and connections to their local communities. And we know that both state and federal governments have underfunded social housing for many years now, and the demand has just continued to grow and grow, and COVID certainly exacerbated that. So for our big redevelopment areas, greenfield and for infill areas like this, we're looking at, well, how do we increase the supply of social housing, and how can development be part of delivering that? So the draft UDF calls on developers in those key development areas where rezonings will occur. So where there's an uplift in the value of the land because of a planning decision. So the values have increased because the development potential of those sites has increased. We're asking for a contribution of 4.6% of their developments for social housing. So this is 1/3 of what we think the community in the overall community of South Geelong will need. And this percentage, or these dwellings, can be delivered as homes as part of the buildings that are built, or as a cash contribution to the Geelong Affordable Housing Trust. And that trust will then distribute that money to deliver homes across the city in partnership with the community housing sector. So this process is known as an inclusionary requirement. So you may have seen in the paper recently, there was a lot of coverage about the state introducing a social housing levy. This is slightly different to that in terms of seeking the houses to be delivered locally, but the concept is similar, where we're looking for a contribution from development where there's substantial value uplift created to contribute to meeting this future housing need. So this approach is certainly a new one in Victoria, and it will be tested through the implementation of the UDF through the planning system. So that's kind of the development side of things. Then in terms of other developments where you might see social housing, it is a key part of the role of the Victorian government, and they may look to use their own land in the precinct for social housing, and that would be on top of the contribution that we'll be seeking from development, as they do right across the city. And we may also have housing providers who already own sites or look to purchase sites in the future that could see additional houses, social housing units built in South Geelong that contribute to meeting that overall need. So I hope that's answered those two questions.
Both Jacqueline and Adam, thank you. So just carrying on, just leading into the social infrastructure to meet the needs of population growth. So some of the city's largest social infrastructure is found in this area, the pool and Gardenia Park. Jane, however, highlights the South Geelong Primary School and asks, how will it cope with increased population? Thank you, Jane. Jess, it's back to you.
Thanks, Linda. So council isn't responsible for delivering schools, but we do have an important role in advocating for the community to the state government about what those community needs are and where we're seeing population growth. So we have regular conversations with the Education Department. At the moment, there's currently no plans from the Victorian government to build any additional schools in the South Geelong area. The population forecasts for South Geelong, Drumcondra and Central Geelong, so quite a bigger area, but that's the smallest forecast area, that's regularly monitored. We're forecasting an increase of children aged between 5 and 9, so the little ones. So an extra 175 children over the next 20 years. So they'll be distributed into the school population across those inner suburbs of Geelong. We'll certainly continue to monitor if we see more population growth and demographic change occurring in the South Geelong precinct and those adjacent suburbs, and meet regularly with the Department of Education to highlight where we're seeing that growth that they're not picking up on, and to advocate for the further investment in schools to coincide with that population growth.
Okay, thank you. Now, we also had a couple of comments or questions from people submitted saying, can you just give us an update on what's happening with the South Geelong to Warren Ponds duplication with the rail? Now, the Victorian, there's now a hotline that you can ring to actually get your answers to your questions on the hotline, and there's also a website which is regularly updated. Now I'll get Jacinta or Leila to put both of those links in the chat so that you have them. We are running very hard to the time boundary. We have one last question that Kelly writes: to support active transport and to advocate for street safety upgrades within the UDF. She sees the UDF as a unique opportunity to support active transport for short journeys. Her question is, why have you not included cycle infrastructure on all roads in the UDF?
I'm going to jump in on that one, Linda.
You are.
Thank you.
Please.
So the cycle path network that's shown in the UDF is based on the principal bike network that's developed by DOT in conjunction with the cycling advocacy groups around the city. And I can, so the cycle network that's shown, the idea is that you connect key destinations of interest. So central Geelong to the rail trail, onto the Barwon River and across to Cardinia Park. Whilst it would be amazing if we had dedicated cycle infrastructure on every road and space available for every user and every mode of transport that people might want to use, often the cross sections of the roads and just the sheer investment that's required means that's sort of cost prohibitive when we're looking at trying to deliver this investment right across the entire city. And I think it's difficult to argue that you're delivering a net community benefit for on-road cycle lane for every road when we've got such a great need across the whole city, and we've picked key routes that connect those key destinations. Certainly this UDF doesn't prevent us growing the network over the long term when those priority routes are delivered right across the municipality, and we can come back and revisit where further routes might be needed in this local area. There's also safety initiatives that are proposed in the UDF, such as reduction in speed limits on the local streets down to 40 kilometres an hour, reducing vehicle lanes, the width of them, introducing tree planted central medians in some of the streets. These will all help reduce traffic speeds and make cycling safer on the local roads. And certainly if we've missed any key streets that provide access to key destinations or should be included in that principal cycling network, we'd love to hear that as part of the submission process, because this is, as John said, still an interim final.
Okay. All right, so next steps. Hugh's just asked again that Jacinta's response to his question regarding his earlier question, if it could be highlighted. I know that it was shared with everyone, so we'll just take that as everyone has seen it. So for the moment, but I've just put a put out a comment up for everyone that there is a lot of questions and more things to be discussed. So this will form the basis of those smaller workshops that we spoke about. Jacinta, please, would you do or Leila, the next steps, and we'll close out then. We're on a time boundary.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. So the next steps in this project are the engagement is open until receive feedback until the 8th of April. So that feedback can be made online through the website. You can jot us down an email. You can drop it in at one of the customer service desks if you like. There's also still some one-on-ones available. So if people do have questions specific to their properties, please have a look at the website. There are appointments available for us to answer specific questions about individual properties and how particularly the heritage overlays and how they may affect you. So if you're interested, please make contact. We're looking to review all those submissions that are received and take a final UDF to council by the middle of the year for their consideration. And should the council support the UDF, then we'd be looking to undertake a planning scheme amendment in the second half of this year, and where you would be given further opportunity to participate in that process. So thanks very much, Linda.
All right. Thank you from me, and good night. I hope you found that useful.